This tutorial deals with solving quadratic equations by completing the square. And in number 1, we have to solve this equation by completing the square. Now, remember that any quadratic equation can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. The first step in completing the square is to take the constant, in other words c, to the right hand side. In this case, c is equal to -1, so we move it to the right hand side. It becomes +1. Then the second step is to divide through by the x squared coefficient, in other words by a, which is 2 in this case. So we divide through by 2. Now we take the new x coefficient, which is 3 over 2 in this case. So we take 3 over 2. We multiply it by a half, and we square the answer. And this is 9 over 16. The 9 over 16 we add to both sides. Now, at this stage, we will always end up with a perfect square on the left-hand side. And we can factorize it as follows. We take the square root of the first term, in other words, the square root of x squared, which is x. This sign, so the sign of the second term on the left-hand side, and then the square root of the third term, which is 3/4. And this is all squared. We can add the terms on the right-hand side with a calculator. In this case, it's 41 over 16. Now we want to isolate x on the left-hand side. We can first get rid of the square here on the left-hand side by taking the square root on the right-hand side. The square root of 16 is 4, and in the numerator on the right-hand side, we have the square root of 41. We'll only round off the final answer. Now we can move the 3/4 to the right-hand side and isolate x. We can write the right-hand side with one denominator of 4. So it's one fraction. So x will equal -3 plus the square root of 41 all over 4, or x equals -3 minus the square root of 41 all over 4. And these we can work out on a calculator. In this case, x is equal to 0.85 using a calculator. And here x is equal to -2.35. Let's solve the second equation here. So the first step is to move c to the right-hand side. In this case, c is equal to +1. So this is equal to -1. Then the second step is to divide through by the x squared coefficient. In other words, to divide through by a, which is -1 in this case. So we divide through by -1. Now we take the new x coefficient. In other words, -2. We multiply it by a half, and we square the answer. And this comes to 1. So we add 1 to both sides. Then on the left-hand side, we end up with a perfect square. So we can factorize it as such. So we take the square root of the first term, the square root of x squared, which is x. the sign of the second term here, which is a negative, and in the square root of the third term on the left-hand side, which is 1. And this is all squared. On the right-hand side, we'll have 2. Now we isolate x. We can get rid of the square here by taking the square root on the right-hand side. We want to isolate x, so we can move the negative 1 here to the right-hand side. And we find that x equals 1 plus the square root of 2, or x equals 1 minus the square root of 2. So let's do this on a calculator. We get 2.41 for the one answer. One minus the square root of 2 gives us negative 0.41. Let's look at number 3 here. First, we're going to move the constant, in other words, negative 4, to the right-hand side. Now we're going to divide through by the x squared coefficient, in other words, by a. In this case, a is equal to 1, so dividing through by a won't make a difference here. So we're going to go to the next step. And the next step is to take the x coefficient, in other words 3, to multiply it by a half, to square the answer. So this is going to be 9 over 4. And this we add to both sides of the equation. On the left-hand side, we have a perfect square now, so we can factorize it. So the square root of x squared is x, then the sign, and the square root of 9 over 4 is 3 over 2. And this is all squared. We can do the right-hand side on a calculator, and this comes to 25 over 4. Now we want to isolate x. We can get rid of the square here by taking the square root on the right-hand side. So the square root of 25 over 4 is 5 over 2. Now we can move the 3 over 2 to the right-hand side. And we can write the right-hand side as one fraction over one denominator of 2. So we find that x equals negative 3 plus 5 over 2, or x equals negative 3 minus 5 over 2. So this comes to 1 here, and here we have negative 4. Let's look at this equation. We're first going to write or rewrite this equation in standard quadratic form. In other words, with descending powers of x. So it's going to be negative a half x squared. In other words, a term in x squared first, then the term in x, so negative x, and then the constant. Now we're going to move the constant to the right-hand side. And we're going to divide through by the x squared coefficient, in other words, by negative a half. So we end up with x squared This is negative 1 here in front of the x. So negative 1 divided by negative a half is positive 2. Then on the right hand side, negative 3 divided by negative a half is positive 6. Now we take the new x coefficient, we multiply it by a half, and we square the answer. And this comes to 1. So we add 1 to both sides. Then on the left-hand side of the equation, we have a perfect square, and we can factorize it. So the square root of the first term, the square root of x squared is x. This sign, which is a plus, and the square root of the third term on the left-hand side. So the square root of 1 is 1. And this is all squared. On the right-hand side, we'll get 7. We want to isolate x, so we can take the square root on the right-hand side. And now we can move the 1 here to the right-hand side. So we find that x equals negative 1 plus the square root of 7, or x is negative 1 minus the square root of 7. And this we can do on a calculator. So we get 1.65. And negative 3.65.